My name is Kieron Boyle, and I'm the Chief Executive of Guy's and St Thomas's Charity. Now, I'll spare a few blushes. If you live outside of South East London, you might never have heard of the charity, but I'm here to try and change that today. So just in case you haven't heard of us, we're an independent, place-based foundation, and we exist to improve people's health. Now, what's different about us is that we only work in the London boroughs of Lambeth and Southwark. And because we're one of the UK's largest foundations, that means we get to do a lot of different things in a really small space. And we get to do that alongside some amazing local leadership. So just to orientate you, Lambeth and Southwark are fantastically vibrant places. They're also, in many respects, extreme examples of the modern inner city environment. They're both richer and poorer, more ethnically diverse and more densely populated than most other places in the UK. And the big issues we have in our boroughs, so issues like some of Europe's highest child obesity rates, the extraordinary overlap between deprivation and people living with multiple long-term conditions, those are exactly the same issues that exist in other cities too. So think of our work as a sort of innovation testbed for urban health. Alongside Guy's and St Thomas's hospitals, what we focus on is the most complex health challenges. And we've been at it for over 500 years now. And these challenges seem to us as complex as they have ever been. Now they relate not only to people's physical and mental health, but also to what people perceive a healthy life to be. They relate not only to the absence of illness, but also people's ability to thrive. And as a result of that, we think progress comes from three things: people, place, and partnership. So let me give you a pitch on those. Like many of you here today, we believe that the best work on complex health issues starts from a simple perspective, that of the person, in shifting from a system that asks, what's the matter with you, to asking, what matters to you. But like many of you here, our experience tells us that the shift is surprisingly difficult to do well in practice. And across the world, systems tend to see health as something provided for and through people rather than created with and alongside. And that's why we think days like today are so important to help us all imagine how we might begin to shift those systems. Our experience also tells us that place is really important. We found that health improvements have a better chance of succeeding when rooted in a really deep understanding of people's context, from the streets they avoid, to the shops that they buy from, to the services that they either use or ignore because of who they feel they are for. And to inform our own thinking, we recently commissioned some ethnographic research from the brilliant agency Us Creates. This report looks at how the urban environment impacts on health. There are copies out back. Do please take a look at it. It's fascinating. We've also got loads of them with us, so it would help us if you took some away. The insights from this report, I think, are really interesting. The impact of urban, diverse and deprived environments is essentially really complex. It varies from individual to individual. In some cases, the risk factors of urban living are amplified by diversity and deprivation. In other cases, they seem to cancel each other out. For example, faith or community ties provide protection for some against the high health risks, the high cost of living or poor housing. All of which leads us to believe that if you really want to make a significant dent in health, then you need to do many different things at once, and that the answers lie in partnership. Coalitions that combine communities with the statutory sector, civic society and businesses, the sorts of voices that this afternoon's final panel represents. So, I guess to close out, partnerships is why we're here today, because alongside Nesta, we're on the lookout for them. So, if you're interested in the same issues as us, if you're interested in people-centred approaches, in urban health, or of taking a place-based lens to complex health issues, then do please get in touch with us. We'd love to have the conversation. Thank you.
Right, we're now going to move on to a final conversation about where we go next. So what to do with the ideas, the energy, the suggestions that have come up from today. And we're going to be helped not just by Kieron as a place-based funder, but if you could join us on stage. Sorry, I'm booming. Michael Macdonnell, a strategy director of NHS England, and therefore someone with a really uniquely well placed to sort of see how the whole system fits together, how the pieces work. Sian Lockwood, who's an entrepreneur, innovator across many, many different fronts. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the insights our speakers have gained, what's inspired you, but then I hope we can widen out, not to so much a Q&A, but more I'm hoping some A's from all of you in the light of what you've heard during the day. What do you think should be done over the next year or two so that perhaps if we come back in May 2018, which feels like a long time away, there's a real sense of progress, of achievements being built on. So to kick us off, I'm going to ask Sian and then Michael just to say a little bit about what do you actually do day to day. Introduce yourselves to these,
it's going to be hard, Geoff.
these fine people. Sian, kick us off.
Can you hear me, first of all? Yes, so I'm on. So I run a community interest company called Community Catalysts. We work through local partners to help local people set up health and social care solutions for other local people. So we're all about creating choice. We're all about blurring the distinction between people who use services and people who provide them, because many of our entrepreneurs themselves need some support. All the services are always co-designed, because you wouldn't you, when you're supporting a very small number of people. And we're a capacity building organisation, so we only go in for a few years and then we will come out having left legacy. We work through local structures. We try and strengthen and build upon what's already working well. Our USP is really boring. We are really good at knowing how to help very small organisations negotiate regulation, legislation, bureaucracies that are very difficult for very small organisations to encounter and deal well with. We care about quality, sustainability and safety just as much as everybody else, particularly sustainability, because many community enterprises without support fail within the first year. We're not interested in that kind of failure rate. And the way we work, which is a mixture of very dull, very boring live, patient coaching, taking people from idea to practical reality, and expert support, seems to work with a whole range of different people. Halima says I can tell one story just very quickly,
Okay, yeah.
which is of a guy, thank you, thank you for nodding, a guy called Rob Ayres, who is one of the community entrepreneurs we have the privilege of working with. He's set up an organisation called TACT, based in Telford. He himself, for 20 years, had struggled with drug addiction. He'd been in and out of prison. He finally managed to pull himself out of that situation and realised there wasn't very much around for people like him. So he set up TACT to help other people like him. He encountered huge anxiety, you can imagine, from health and social care professionals who looked at this man with a criminal record, who struggled with drug addiction and thought this is not a safe guy to tell people about. So he set himself up on a voluntary basis and slowly began to win hearts and minds. He's now got a public health contract, several public health contracts, and when I spoke to the Director of Adult Social Services recently, it's all he ever talked about was what he was doing and his ability to mobilise community. So I'm here, I think, because there is a belief that these really hyper-local solutions can't scale. And we have an example from our work in Somerset, our recent work in Somerset, which shows they can. So we work in West and South Somerset in the most rural parts where home care can't go, won't go. There is no home care provision for people. People are staying in hospital longer than they need to. They're going to residential care sooner than they need to. And over 2.5 years, we have uncovered 38 enterprises that were already working there, nobody knew about, and supported the development of another 177. Between them, they are providing 3,500 hours of home care a week. They're supporting 800 people, and they've created, in the process, 270 jobs.
Thank you.
Right.
Michael, so say a little bit about what you do, and perhaps also, if you've got a story or two, what excites you in this agenda?
Well, that's a hard act to follow, but thanks for inviting me to spend some time with you this afternoon. So I'm Strategy Director at NHS England, which is the bit of the health service that buys over £100 billion of services on behalf of the English people in particular. It also plays a role in trying to shape what those services should look like and how we can get fit for the future. So I think about my job as a combination of both trying to catalyse those new services and new services that are better suited to what we need rather than perhaps what we might have needed in the past, and to try to do that without going broke. So between those two things, it keeps me busy. I'm Canadian, by the way, if you're wondering where this weird accent is from. Some of you are looking at me in that way. I'm used to it. I'll get it off my chest and get it off yours now. I've been working a little bit with, here's my story then. So the specific work that I've been doing with Nesta is as an angle, I guess, on people-powered health, where we've been doing something called 100-day trials, which is really not so much even in people-powered health as staff-powered health. And it's trying to harness the power of the front line to solve problems that they can solve, they know how to solve, they've wanted to solve, they have the resources to solve, but for reasons of hierarchy, history, lack of resources, haven't felt empowered to do so. So we've got a program underway where we're trying to think about how to do elective care differently. So if you went and got your hips, your knees done, it's not non-emergency care in effect. And what we're trying to do is change the way referrals work, because when you think about it, it's a bit odd how referrals work. There's letters sent back and forth, actual physical letters from GPs to consultants, and they get lost, and there's big file cabinets and so forth, so it feels very ripe for disruption. Too little involvement of actual patients and people and the decisions that are made about them, when we know the evidence shows when you do involve people, they make very different choices in their own care. Often they elect to do things which are much less intensive, not to have that operation, or to use their families or carers in different ways. And then most excitingly, a little bit for a wonk like me, is to get rid of the outpatient model, which when you think about it is also a completely strange thing. You go and sit in a room with some posters falling off often for 4 hours waiting to see a single clinician. I can't think of another industry where there are waiting rooms like that. It feels high time that we've got going on how to replace them with a different way of delivering healthcare. And I think, and in some of the teams that we're working with across the country, have started to show that you can really do away with lots of them. They can be either served virtually or in groups, or some of it is just created because we've always created it. So we got these teams working all across the country trying to solve on those three problems, and it's been absolutely fascinating to see what they've been able to come up with if you just give them a bit of space and a bit of time.
Fantastic. Well, what I'd like to ask all three of you is some comments on the conversation which I've heard quite a lot around today, which essentially seems to go like this. Look, here there's a lot of fantastic projects happening around the country, amazing innovators, all sorts of ways of tapping, just as you said, Michael, lots of untapped resources either within the system or outside in patients and families and communities. But what would it take to really make these part of the mainstream? Absolutely common sense, absolutely scaled, to use Sian's language, rather than lots of good projects, but slightly on the margins of the big stuff. So Kieron, can you kick us off on that very small question?
Brill. I'll start, and Sian and Michael will finish it with style. Hey, I've heard three things today that I think play a really critical role in this. I think something, firstly, around the breadth of coalition that exists in this. So I think the point around scale is a really interesting one, because there's probably a kind of a pre-question to all of that, of what sort of scale are we talking about? What is the right level of scale for the change that we're looking to see? And then how do we build out the coalition that exists to the size of that? The second thing I've heard is we had a session with around the Lambeth Living Well network and asked the question of, taking 7 years for this to come together, 7 years plus, could you do it quicker? And everybody on the platform...
Could you just tell people who weren't in that session what it's about? So
essentially, this is a brilliant and bold commissioning approach to saying, how do we take an asset-based approach to mental health services, essentially? And so they were asked the question of could it take less than 7 years? And everybody looked a bit awkward on the panel, with a sense of, well, would you want it to take less than 7 years? Actually, there was something about the time it takes to build relationships, and us all being very comfortable with things taking that amount of time. And so there's something, I think, which isn't the silver bullet solution, but exactly what I've heard today is you've got to get the basic stuff right. You've got to really invest in the relationships, and you've got to really focus on the data that supports that as well. So it's not a kind of a silver bullet to this, but I think those are some of the practical things that start getting you to the right level of scale that you should be looking at.
And you're sort of saying be patient a bit.
Yeah, or I think to get that balance that we heard this morning between be both patient and impatient at the same time.
Sean.
I'd probably go with be humble. At least our experience in Somerset is because the local authority is both brave and humble. It's courageous enough to say, actually, we're going to take a risk here. These little enterprises don't look like normal, traditional stuff. And we're going to be humble enough to say to the people who want to buy things, we trust you to do that well. So I think humility and trust are good things, collaboration certainly, but at all sorts of different levels. I think a one-size-fits-all solution is a disaster. Even within the work we've been doing in Somerset, where we are working in kind of 10 villages, each village has different people who make that village work, different organisations who make that village work, and it's important to create sort of local solutions or to support local solutions that are messy and that use the structures and strengths that are already out there. And the other thing I'd say to Commission is it's to do with the risk thing, I suppose, is to just try and get out of the way a bit and trust people. Because actually people do make good decisions themselves. And I mean, randomised clinical trials do not come into my world. They couldn't, because we're working with very, very small organisations. But the evidence that people work on is actually the evidence from people who already use that service. It's word of mouth and finding a way to capture word of mouth that actually helps people make safe choices.
Can I just ask both of you, though, a comment on place? Because you're both place-focused in a way. How do you cope with really the unevenness of place? Most parts of England certainly don't have a Guy's and St Thomas's. It'd be great if they all did, with 500-year track record. In a way, many of the sort of projects we've heard about today depend on a lot of energy and motivation and people willing to do stuff, but that means there'll be some places where there isn't that capacity. So how do you not just amplify unevenness if you take this agenda further forward? And in a way, this is a big issue for a national health service, and I'll come to you in a moment, Michael, on this.
Okay, I mean, we've worked across 50 areas, all different demographies, north, south, urban, rural, extremely poor and extremely wealthy. And we have not actually found any place that doesn't have fabulous people in it who want to do stuff. What they might need is a different sort of help. They might need more help at the beginning, and you have to be prepared to. We always employ local people who understand that place. We always understand that local can mean very tiny. In some areas we worked in, it's a couple of streets, and that you have to be imaginative about the kind of support you provide and the patience within which you work with people. We don't have an experience of lumpiness, though, particularly.
Kieron, any comment on that?
I totally echo that. But also, let's lean into strength when we have it. So we have in places like Lambeth and Southwark, but also other places around the UK, this combination of amazing people doing amazing things and then a real need for that amazing stuff to happen. So let's take advantage of that. So a lot of what I've heard today is people sharing, people stealing with pride, and using what's been trialled or tested elsewhere to say, well, how can we take some of the process learning from that and borrow it?
Yeah.
So Michael, so two related questions for you. One is sort of what needs to happen next to make these sort of people-powered health models more part of the mainstream, and how do you do that from an England-wide perspective without leaving holds. Or maybe you agree with what the others said, that anywhere will in fact have the people able to do this stuff.
Yeah, so I would guess sort of 3 comments on the how can we get this to scale or kind of more widespread. I mean, one is definitely to appreciate the gearing about health. I bet it's 1% of all healthcare is provided by hospitals or healthcare providers. Meanwhile, families, communities, individuals, carers provide the rest, and we forget that sort of gearing at our peril. It reminds me of a sort of heat sink in a computer. You don't know it's there, but if it wasn't there, then you'd have a meltdown. And that's precisely the case with health and health care. So I think it's incredibly important for us, especially in times of financial constraints, to be mindful of that and to use some of our resources and energy to try to keep that gearing going in the right direction and indeed make it easier for families, carers, communities to provide the services that they do effectively for free on our behalfs. The second thing I'd say is, one of the things I've found about these 100-day trials that your team and Lehman and others have provided is just the sheer, having a method is really quite important, and it's astonishing how we all go about sort of trying to do change slightly differently everywhere, and just having a kind of way of surfacing how we're going to do stuff, doing it at some sort of pace, curating that learning so that others can capture it later on. That kind of stuff I think is really important, because otherwise you're always starting again. You're always wondering whether it's another little example, and an n=1 is not really worthwhile to anybody. We've got to try to build the sense that, if not randomized controlled trials, at least we've got some wider experience and a method that we can apply that does begin to work. And the third thing I'd say is, for national bodies like mine, I think we do have to get our minds into being platforms often. So we're never going to be particularly good at helping carers do a better job or launching social movements, or we need to, I think, appreciate the kind of barriers or the boundaries of our own powers as state actors, and instead become platforms for non-state actors, many of whom are clearly sitting in this room. On the lumpiness problem, I mean, clearly health inequalities and so forth are a major issue and concern for us. But I agree with Kieron that we have to go kind of where the energy is on this. We don't have enough kind of great leaders and great ideas and loads of energy. So I think it behooves us to kind of go where it is. Yes, we have to then learn how to spread it and make sure that others can take advantage of it. But if we kind of level down, that's a bad place to be for us. I think we ought to be encouraging more experimentation, not less.
Fantastic. Well, look, I'd like to open this up to your answers. You can ask questions if you like, but in some ways it'd be more interesting if you had thoughts in the light of what you've heard today about what could be done next, possibly by the NHS, by a funder, by entrepreneurs, or indeed by yourself. So who would like to kick off? And perhaps we've got a mic coming to here in the third row. Who else would like to kick into the conversation now? And have we got any Slido questions to show as well? But if we could start here in the third row, gentleman with the glasses, it's there, and then at the end there. If you could collaboratively pass the microphone along.
Is that on?
Yeah.
Is it on? Yeah. Alec Robertson, Design Futures. One thing we've heard a great deal about throughout the day is data, the problems of silos, of ownership. There really is needed a campaign, a public awareness campaign, almost on the lines of that you used to see on safety. Do you think that would really get over some of the problems of trust and
So what would the
cooperation?
campaign say?
It would say, beware of this, but data is good for this and that and the other. And it could be integrated into a soap, for example, to get public awareness.
And who would the public believe for a message on data?
Well, they'd make their own mind up, I think.
Okay. All right. Let's take the question at the end there.
Shirley Ayres, Connected Care Network. My suggestion is that organisations start to be prepared to share the learning from failure. There is a real disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality of a lot of strange words that have no meaning in relation to the lives and the experiences that people have. And I think social media provides an interesting field for people to challenge what is said publicly. And I'd just like to see everybody be prepared not only to share the learning from failure, but to tell us what they're going to do differently. In a sense, a bit like Geoff is saying today, how are we going to assess the impact of today's event in a year's time? What will really make a difference? And I'm really thinking about this because we can't afford to get it wrong.
Yeah, it's the only way to learn. Can a quick show of hands, how many people in this room have been involved in a failure of any kind? Okay, thank you. Hands up, who would like to share experiences of that failure with the rest of the audience? Okay, I've got plenty. I could keep you all night. But I think this is the real dilemma. Systems only learn through failure, but it is quite threatening to share those in a often rather, unforgiving environment. But let's come. Maybe I'll ask our speakers to reflect on all three of those. What sort of public campaigns might be needed, for example, on the benefits of certain kinds of data sharing? Who would like to kick off with that? Michael?
So I agree, and there's clearly going to be a response after the election from Caldecott in particular. The Caldecott response will come from the government. But I think you're right that we need to build some faith in data sharing because there's an awful lot of suspicion about it, some of it for very good reason, and not enough understanding of what it can actually allow us to do, which is in safer services and all sorts of other benefits. So I do think we need that. I occasionally think we make the campaign a little too theoretical. So instead of being able to actually show tangible improvements that are a result of data sharing, we ask people to believe in things that theoretically might be the case. And I think that's a very hard case to make. So I think we've got to get more tangible, notch up more successes, point to them, and then make the case off the back of that. So my sort of reflection on data sharing. I mean, learning from failure, I couldn't agree more. And when you work in government, it can be, this is a very difficult one for us because failure, they get a hold of that. It's all over the media, careers are ended and that sort of thing. So although we might say we'd like to learn from failure, actually all the incentives around make it very hard to do that. So I think, we need to get, leaders need to be a bit more mature about that. The public maybe needs to be a bit more mature about that. And we need to create some safer kind of environments where we can exchange those sorts of discussions.
So maybe Sian and Kieron, could you comment on this question too? What would allow the system to be more at ease learning from failures as well as successes?
I think entrepreneurs, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I wave my head around, which is why they've taken the lapel mic away from me. I think learning from failure is what entrepreneurs have to do. I mean, you in order to take a risk, you have to be prepared to fail, and then you have to learn from that and improve. So the approach we now use 7 years on is very different from the approach we used 7 years ago. There's some bits that are the same. Lots of bits didn't work, and we're continually trying to improve and learn. And we're always aware. I tell you, the other thing that's important is being aware of the possibility of failure, because I think that gives you a bit of a grit in your system, but it also means that you're looking out for possibilities of failure which you can guard against. And I think we're kind of comfortable around failure as entrepreneurs, and it is, and certainly we would really welcome platforms in which we could share possibilities of failure, learning from failure, try ways in which you can guard against failure. So I'm very keen on any idea of a platform, Kieron.
Yeah.
There's a very famous saying that every success looks like a failure in the middle, but that's one of the reasons why one shouldn't be too comfortable with failure, because then you might say, oh, it's failed, and sort of relax, rather than driving through to turn the failure into a success, which is what people do when there's a real stake involved. Kieron?
It's such a good critical question. I mean, partly because we've heard today of the importance of failing fast, but it's a real blocker to that is kind of recognising when that's happening. I think, though, I'll turn it round. We're supremely comfortable with failure. A lot of the system is failing around us right now. Often what we're uncomfortable with is a new failure, and often a new failure that has our name next to it. So I know that I'm kind of on the coalition banging brigade here, but I think that is part of the answer too. Moving in packs on this stuff does help, does help in saying that it's not just down to one individual, that the learning or the failure exists a kind of across a system as well. So I think it is such a critical question.
Okay, there's a question in row about 6 there, but just before we turn to you, the gentleman who was the only person to offer to share his own failure. You don't have to do that now, but I think you do earn the right to say something. So the mic's there.
My observation is a response to the question, what next for people-powered health? How about 7% of the MADL and NMET budget being made available by this time next year to support the projects and interventions that colleagues in this room want to implement? We spend $5 billion a year on education and training. I've worked in the NHS for a long time. We have got what we have. Unless we follow the money and the funding streams change, then we'll end up with the kinds of failures that we don't need. One day, someone's going to ask me what that major failing was. So I'm going to tell you, because I won't be here next year. That is, we created a corporate university for the NHS called the NHSU. We engaged with 103,000 staff and patients on a people-powered health project, and it was pulled. So there's another story to how we get to where we are today. Thank you very much. You asked for it.
Yeah, no, thank you. And here, two rows forward.
Thank you. I wondered, in times where change may be slow, and we were talking about 7 years, and needing to navigate through some failures before you get to success, what are the strategies for keeping change makers resilient and helping, if we're trying to sort of foster and promote a resilient communities, we need to keep resilient ourselves. And I think just one observation in terms of what might make a difference. My experience is that constant change is and unmeetable deadlines are one of the things that really undermines resilience, even in very committed people. So if there is a message to NHS England or to other people who are, I'm involved in a commissioning group which are constantly on the back foot trying to fulfill deadlines, put in proposals for things. We only just got our heads around STPs when we were trying to bid for cancer transformations, which were asking us to combine STPs. And so there's a lot of, I think one of the things about resilience is being able to feel empowered to do the things that you want to do. So that's only one element of it, but I'd be very interested in panelists' views on fostering a resilience building and asset building culture.
So what's the right pace of change? I should say, when I worked in central government, I oversaw a team looking at NHS strategy a long time ago, and we came up with a very radical proposal to have a moratorium on any structural changes for 5 years, which of course got no backing at all. But it was probably right. And yeah, here.
So it's really on this subject of sharing mistakes. So we started something about a year ago called the Ideas Hub, ideashub.org.uk if you want, which is small stories about great co-production, community. It was the 4 of us, we were all roving consultants in different ways, and we just kept hearing great stories like Sian's from Somerset, and we just wanted to write about them. Because the N=1 thing, yes, it has some power. If there's somebody else trying to do the same thing and don't feel brave, their organisation won't let them. If they hear of somebody else who's done that exact thing, they can do it. Now, on the Ideas Hub, we also had a theme which was never waste a mistake. Because, and all our interviews that we do with people who've done some fantastic things, we always ask them, what's your best mistake? So all I'm saying is, Sian, if you want a platform, we already have an online platform where we're publishing stories. And if, I would love to talk to people who want to do that in Let's Share Our Mistakes. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, let's have some responses. Perhaps, Sian, would you like to kick us off? Because you've got the biggest microphone.
I have, yes, I have. I've got control now. I think change makers and resilience, I think you're absolutely right that if you feel in control of your pace of change, you have endless resilience. So And my organisation has been going for 7 years. We very nearly went bust in 2011, but you kind of power through that because you're in control of that, and you just you know that if you work a bit harder and you get a bit cleverer, you'll get through that. Whereas I think if you're at the mercy of change imposed from the outside, it's a very, very different experience. We can only talk about change makers who we rely on, because for all of our projects, we are heavily dependent upon the imaginative and very brave change makers within bureaucracies. And I think they would probably, I hope, they'd probably say to you that we nurture them, I have to tell you. We try and bring them together because I do think it helps to give each other courage and to know that you're not alone in the fight you're having to have with your procurement or your commissioning or your whatever. And I think they get sustenance, as we do, from the amazing people that we work with. So I think there's something about really great stories, which are not just good ways of learning, but good ways of kind of energising you yourself.
Michael?
What a great question. I love that question, actually. I haven't thought about it enough, but here's some sort of slightly random thoughts. I mean, one of them definitely is patience, isn't it? I mean, and I know that from a national body sounds a little bit ironic, but believe it or not, with sustainability and transformation partnerships, that's what we're trying to do, is give a bit of space for areas to take control of their own destiny. Now, you know, we're just starting out on that, but we are trying to explore the possibilities for devolution, which means giving local staff communities, some further control over it. But anyway, so patience and some of that autonomy and flexibility. I guess the other thing I'd say is I've always felt that you need staging posts as well. So if you've only got the kind of just over the horizon miracle kind of silver bullet thing, you made a mistake. You've got to have some things along the way, because what you find is your path changes along, and what you thought was good wasn't so good, and what you thought was bad, what turns out to be worth having. So you need some staging posts on it.
I help the statutory sector out because it's not just them who change all the time. Funders do it as well. It's such an important question that you ask. I guess we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that the change maker is just the entrepreneur, though. A large part of what I think we've been discussing today is that the change makers do exist in the communities and the informal networks that we surround ourselves with. And I think there's a kind of, let's think about the resilience there. How do we build communities' ability to connect with each other? How do we have to think quite differently about what the role of the statutory sector is in that? And it's quite challenging stuff, but not just for the NHS, for funders as well.
So I've got time for a couple more questions. I'm then going to give each of you a chance to say or to ask one thing of the audience here, what you would like people to go out and do differently. But before then, at the second row here and then at the back, if you could keep your comments or questions very pithy now, and then in the third row then.
I think we do need to go back to...
Could you introduce yourselves?
Toby Chambers, social kind of innovator. I think we need to go back to the human capital of the NHS, particularly kind of moving forward. I kind of fear there's this whole kind of immigration kind of issue is going to be the biggest barrier moving forward, because you're potentially going to lose a huge amount of skill level, and somehow getting that message out to people that actually immigration is actually a good thing as well.
And then at the back there, yeah.
Hello, I'm Helen. I'm a service designer from the BSA in Newcastle. My question is basically, how do we prevent the NHS's almost perverse obsession with silos and actually just concentrate on solving human problems rather than a devolved policy and departments, and it's kind of systemic across government in general?
I'm sure Michael can fix that very easily. And there, yeah.
I'm Tom. I work at the RSA, which is partnering on Nesta on a health program. I was in the breakout session with some of the Nesta team, and they were talking, and there was a junior doctor who made a really interesting intervention, and so that basically the way that doctors and medical schools are operating on a medical model, and actually possibly what's next for people-powered health is actually a more social model that's demonstrated in what clinicians are taught right at the beginning of their career. So I'm interested in thoughts.
So quite a focus on skills, teaching, human capital. Can I ask you each to make a final comment? And as I said before, if you would like to throw a challenge to the audience as well, please do so. Perhaps Kieron, you might start?
Yeah, so mine's an easy one because I said it before. We're really interested in exploring these sorts of issues in Lambeth and Southwark, so do please come talk to us. We'd love to work with people who are interested in exploring the same sort of stuff. I think you hit the nail on the head, humility. Sharon said it this morning, the answers exist in people. They're out there. We don't know the answers, but they exist in people. And that's what we're keen to explore as Guys and St Thomas's charity.
And for us, I think it's about, we love collaboration. We are one very small organisation. We work with loads of different people. So anybody who is keen on collaboration, we'd love to talk to you. Anybody who has a platform like yours, which is about enabling collaboration, I think we'd also be really excited about talking. There's too little money in the world, isn't there? And there's too little energy. We need to use it well.
So I just briefly to respond to my colleague over on the silos question. I mean, there's no easy answer to that. The hard work and the hard graft of integrating services, integrating funding, and beginning to shape a health service is more suited to people with chronic disease and so forth is just what we've got to get on with. That's the job, and it's not going to be solved overnight, but neither can it wait another day. My challenge to people is to find somebody tomorrow and try to overcome their cynicism. So I think more than money, more than lots of other problems we've got is the sense, especially in public services and the NHS, that it's all going a bit to pot. We can't really do anything. Well, actually, when I come from Canada, I traveled around the world before this job. The number of countries that look up to your health service, the amount of good things do happen, and the solution's in your hands. So the cynicism is going to be the one way that we destroy it.
Thank you. Well, I think that deserves a round of applause, as do all our speakers. In a very few minutes, there's going to be drinks and something to eat when you'll be able to take up these sort of requests for collaboration, partnership, etc., from our speakers. But just before we do that, I'm going to say a few final words, and I hope we're going to see on screen the results of the Slido question from earlier in the day. Not that one, those are various questions, which are fascinating questions. So this was really the question of, so what's the mood in the room about how far a people-powered, data-driven health and care system, how far advanced are we? And you all being sort of cautiously optimistic people, not cynics and fatalists, have 2/3 said some progress but still a way off. Nearly there, 0%, I'm afraid. 27%, quite a long way to go. So I think that's probably, I guess, what we hoped for. It would be kind of boring if we were there. There'd be nothing to talk about. If you really thought it was so far off that it was completely out of reach, that would also be a little bit demoralising. And in a way, I think that's been the tone of the whole day. And quite a few of your comments about patience were really interesting. Because I think we've got some opposites necessarily sort of in tension here. And Sharon said this right at the beginning, as did Halima. You have to be patient about the pace of changes, which are changes in how people think, how they work, how they behave. Those don't happen overnight by diktat or by passing a law. But if people like you aren't impatient and always with a sense of urgency, always trying to get things to happen faster, then nothing will ever change. So it's really important to have the end of patience in both its meanings, while also having a sense of sort of the long term of how change actually happens. I think what's really interesting about today and this whole field, and it perhaps relates to that, is it's one where I think practice is some way ahead of theory. It's people doing stuff who are creating the health service of the future more than people sort of writing blueprints in universities or anywhere else, with all respect to the academics in the audience. And that's what gives it energy, But it also does mean every now and again it's important to try and stand back and make sense of what is actually emerging almost organically from so much activity on the ground. And I was going to say very briefly 2 or 3 sort of observations on what we've heard about that, that picture. And I should say I really want to echo what Kieron said in terms of thanks to everyone who has spoken and shared and really given a sense of, say, the really good practice happening. And perhaps I want to do a show of hands on this. How many people in this room have heard something today which will make you act in a different way, something which has given you a specific idea to act on differently in your work? Okay, that is a nice, that's I guess what we hoped for, is you come away with practical ammunition. So I think the first thing I wanted to say is, I think all of this agenda is not so much about either or, but it's about both and. And going back to what you just said, it would be strange if medical schools weren't medical at all. But it's medical and social, needs to be the curriculum, the spirit, and so on. And we're seeing sort of hybrids emerging, which is where really Sharon kicked us off. On the one hand, in some ways, old traditions of medical science, of evidence-based medical science, with indeed RCTs sometimes, is continuing to evolve and become deeper, and extraordinary breakthroughs being made in terms of knowledge and in terms of the depth of professional knowledge and training right across the system, like the health service. We wouldn't want in any way that to roll back or be diminished, but it's now being joined with very different kinds of knowledge, the knowledge which comes from experience, from patients, or whatever we're going to call them, from patients turned innovators, parents turned innovators and funders. And that's an extraordinary change in the knowledge system of health. And more recently, it's also being linked into data, into, again, citizen-generated data. There will be increasingly sensor-generated data, and so on. And that's what makes this such an exciting time to be in this field. It's almost as if the whole sort of world, the whole health service is becoming what was just, had in the past only happened in labs. We can all be part of both the generation of knowledge and its use. And that's the promise, which is sort of in sight, but I think not yet part of the sort of the everyday norms. The bigger picture then, and I guess this is probably obvious to you, but may not be to the cynics we may be interacting with tomorrow or next week, is that a very different vision of how a health service should run is emerging almost out of the mist. And that's what I think that those percentages were about. One in which power is much more shared between the top and the bottom, where it's both vertical and also horizontal, much more peer-to-peer support, where that knowledge and data is not just being harvested at the top, but again is part of the everyday life of a citizen, a patient, a parent, and where we see that kind of co-production, that running a health service, as Kieron said, with not just 2 and 4 becomes normal. That involves a huge shift of, I guess, resources and brain power, I think, from what dominated the 20th century health system, where far more went into essentially pharmaceutical solutions or medtech solutions or surgical solutions rather than into social solutions or environmental ones or more human ones. And that we're beginning to see a shift in terms of where the R&D budgets go, in terms of the practice, is very welcome. It's also very overdue, but still has probably quite a long way to go. In terms of the actual amounts of money being invested in social behavioural aspects of health relative to the others, I don't know if anyone in this room could guess what the percentages are. I would guess it's still not much more than 1% of the research budget going into the sorts of things we're talking about here. Now, very little of what we've been talking about today has been part of the general election debate, with one slight exception, which is mental health. We do have a Prime Minister, who may well be re-elected, willing to talk about mental health, talking about more resources going into mental health. And in many ways, mental health has suffered, for all the reasons we've been talking about, it has been the poor relation. It has had far less invested in fundamental basic research, applied research and so on, than other fields of health care. And that arguably is one of the reasons why the state of service provision in many ways is so far behind what we expect for cardiac disease, cancers and so on. But at last, we are seeing, I think, a change in the political language around mental health. Again, very long overdue, but welcome, and probably the only bit of this agenda which will show up in the question times and so on of the next few weeks. Very final sort of thought on where this all goes. For us as Nesta, and I hope you've had those of you who didn't already know them, had a chance to talk to Halima and Annie and Dan and John and the others in our fantastic health lab. We're, I think, getting new energy out of hearing what all of you have got to say, and in terms of the work we will be doing in backing innovators and innovations, helping them get to scale, working with the NHS on the sort of systems change projects Michael mentioned, and also looking at how, as we see a flood of new technologies coming out from artificial intelligence and machine learning, the Internet of Things, all these sort of things, how we actually use those technologies to empower us as human beings rather than see them do the opposite, which I think is, of course, a risk. But that requires aligning quite a few things. The spirit, which is in this room, definitely. The economics, and is really important that these arguments are made in an economic way as well as a human and an ethical way, to show how, in fact, they are probably the only route to a financially sustainable health service. I can't see any other way of having a financially sustainable health service unless it taps the knowledge, the energy, the commitment of far more people, both inside and outside the system. But also, again, as Michael said, method. A lot does actually boil down to having good and spreadable method. I think if you pull all those pieces together, it is possible to glimpse a very different kind of NHS in the not too distant future, perhaps a bit more like a platform than like a sort of system doing things to people. But it strikes me still that although it's probably obvious to most of you, it may not be obvious to most of your fellow citizens, and the fact that we won't read much about it in our newspapers or see much on TV and radio in the next few weeks, we still are locked in a sort of version of talking about health which is in many ways much more backward looking than these conversations. There's still a lot of work to be done of explaining, advocating, encouraging a different way of thinking about a truly people-powered and data-powered system. And I think this is where my sort of answer to the question I asked my colleagues to sort of throw at you. What do we need of the people in this room? I think you are all trailblazers of a future that isn't yet quite known, but will in the fairly near future become absolutely common sense. It will be so obvious to the other 60 million people in this country as it is to you how you should run healthcare, how you should think about things not in terms of patients and so on. That will be obvious, but we're not there yet. And therefore, it's incredibly important that you are the non-cynical, non-fatalistic advocates of that future, and you are willing to be courageous, to take risks, sometimes to have failures, sometimes to jump out of the plane not totally certain you've got a parachute on your back even. Because that's the only way change ever happens, is when the people who can see where the world needs to go are willing to take risks, even career-threatening risks, to make that happen and not just to play it safe. And when you do that, as many of you have shown, it actually inspires and encourages others to take good risks as well. And then all the barriers which at some point seem so difficult to overcome, in fact, crumble away, and it all becomes obvious in time. That's my hope, and I've taken courage from hearing you here, and I really urge you to take courage from each other in pushing the boat out, perhaps taking a few more risks than you might otherwise do, because after all, that's what we all owe to the many millions or tens of millions of people who, in fact, are what we're really talking about here, the half the population living with long-term conditions of one kind or another who are not adequately served by the system at the moment. And as Kieron said, We can talk all we like about the failures of the new, and we often don't even really notice the sort of failure of the old, which just is so much part of our normal environment. We take it for granted. Anyway, that's enough pontificating from me. The really good news for those of you who are now impatient is that we do have drinks and lots of chances to talk and get to know people and forge new partnerships and collaborations just out there. Do please also feed back further thoughts on the day. If you get a sudden blinding flash of inspiration about the solution to all of these things, do share it. Do also feed back on the panels you were in so that we can improve future versions of this event. And please give a big round of applause to everyone who's made this happen. Thank you. And take courage. Thank you.